Forward Guidance is brought to you by VanEck, a global leader in asset management since 1955. You'll be hearing more about VanEck ETFs later on, but for now, let's get into today's interview. Very pleased today. I've got a very special interview. I am speaking with Dr. Ingo Sauer, a postdoc, a junior professor at Goethe University. Professor Sauer, he has a lot of thoughts on what really causes inflation. Maybe it's not what we think. It could have something to do with central bank insolvency and what is on central bank balance sheets. Dr. Sauer, welcome to Forward Guidance. Good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. Tell us what about your book-long paper about 1923? So we will be going back 101 years to the hyperinflation, where the German mark was devalued to over 4 trillion marks to $1, and prices skyrocketed by well over 1 billion%. You also write about hyperinflation in 1923 in Austria, Hungary, and Poland. So what is the common notion about what causes hyperinflation, and what does your paper and your book-long paper, 360 pages, your research find that actually causes hyperinflation?
Obviously, there are many, many reasons for inflation. In this paper, I speak about the very strong inflations. So you have inflation for several reasons: demand and supply issues on labor markets, this cost-driven inflations, demand pull, cost push. But there is a different type of inflation. In the 1920s, it's better to see that those inflations actually were driven by central bank insolvencies. And as a matter of fact, my complete profession overlooked those central bank insolvencies. And therefore, we are badly prepared if such an inflation like we had it in the last 10 years in Argentina, for example, is going to happen here in the euro area. I'm very concerned about my currency, and therefore I want to bring this workings of the stronger inflations when the currency itself is debased. It's not on the markets, demand and supply, labor markets and so forth, where money is used. It's really the currency is debased itself. Money itself loses its value because the institution behind becomes insolvent, not in a legal sense, but in an economic sense. And the central bank becomes vulnerable on foreign exchange markets. We have to probably to deal with that problem. And in the 1920s, they could only stop these inflations by recapitalizing each of these central banks. I studied the 4 great inflations, the 4 famous hyperinflations in Poland, Hungary, Austria, and Germany. We're also not very prepared to recapitalize our central banks if necessary, because there is no research about those recapitalizations. I really try to establish such kind of a research to get some awareness for this problem.
So before we take our time machine back to 1923, the notion of insolvency for a private bank, it's pretty well understood. The loans are not as good, and the value of those loans is less than the liabilities, the deposits, and then there can be a bank run, liquidity, so that causes the bank to fail. The notion of a central bank being insolvent, I would say, yeah, that does challenge many economic orthodoxies because central banks print money. One would think it is kind of impossible. So you do think that this is relevant to the Euro system and the European Central Bank right now. Tell us why that.
Unfortunately, but let me make that comparison between private and central banks. So legally, a central bank obviously can never become insolvent, and nobody can force the central bank to hand out whatever. They have money on its liability side, but it's not a real liability. And even if you are in the gold standard, you can easily leave the gold standard, and no institution whatsoever can force the central bank to pay for these bills, right? But that doesn't mean that the concept of solvency isn't relevant for a central bank. And actually, the confusion also comes from the fact that central banks do not face a liquidity constraint like commercial banks do, right? And like the central bank does when it runs a gold standard, then every time they bring you dollars, you have to pay out gold. So there is a liquidity constraint. Since you can leave the gold standard, like Nixon did in 71, a central bank legally can never become insolvent. But the concept of solvency is applicable to central banks. They become vulnerable on foreign exchange markets. Therefore, we have to look at the balance sheet to really measure like their vulnerability or their capitalization or their undercapitalization. This at the end, you can show it in the 1920s actually quite good. This at the end defines the value or the valuation of those notes. Yeah. So at the end, all these currency, all these notes, they are valuated by the public if and only if the institution behind is solvent enough to defend this currency on foreign exchange markets. If that is not the case, at first speculators react, but then the general public, like it was the last 10 years in Argentina, they change this currency because they want a hard currency to a different currency. And at the end, even so legally the central bank does not face any problems and cannot become insolvent, it's insolvent at foreign exchange markets, which they try to regulate, but that regulation never really works out. And therefore, we can apply the concept of solvency. Yeah, not liquidity, but the concept of solvency is applicable to central banks.
Thank you for laying that out. But then can you just quickly give a little teaser for the audience about how that applies to today in 2024 about the European Central Bank?
And the European Central Bank accumulated a lot of risky assets, mostly government bonds. And as you know, now the crisis countries and my country probably in the near future becomes one more crisis country. But at the beginning, after the European debt crisis, which first peaked in 2012, but even before, our national central banks actually, so it's not the ECB, which issues the money supply, but it's the national central banks. It's a system of central banks. So the Euro system itself, they intervened and they bought a lot of government bonds. And then we had, in the aftermath, we had like after 2015, and again for Corona, we had huge purchasing programs. Still, we are more or less in a balanced position. So our currency is still backed. Yeah, even if you take the market values of all these government bonds and Euro system, these national central banks also have quite a huge equity position. But those are very risky assets. And my claim is if those government bonds lose, let's say, for the crisis countries, and probably even in Northern Europe, 1/3, half of its value on markets, then the Euro system itself becomes vulnerable and the Euro is going to be a weak currency, probably not as bad as the Argentine pesos, but could be like half as severe, let's say. And there is another problem that this system of central banks, it's a currency union. Yeah, we still have all these national central banks issuing the euro, and it can obviously, like it happened always for currency unions, it can at one day fall apart, and there are huge claims and liabilities between these different national central banks. And some countries will suffer, or some national central banks will suffer enormous losses. So my concern is, because I'm German, that the Bundesbank could suffer losses which are in a magnitude that it becomes very difficult to recapitalize the Bundesbank after such an event, because it ranges, it's about 1,000 billion euros that the Bundesbank claims against the other national central banks against the system. Those claims are called target balances. So that's the second concern. So first, that the euro itself becomes a weak currency, and probably after we enter that stage, at some point the euro system can fall apart, and then some central banks suffer losses because they're not 100% compensated for their claims they accumulated against the rest of the system. I don't know when it's going to happen. I'm just saying, like, if there is pressure on bond prices, then also the central banks at the end become vulnerable. Yeah, and that can happen in 5 years from now, in 2 years from now. It's going to happen in stages. But a weak currency definitely at the end means that the euro devaluates further, yeah, and that this becomes the main reason for price increases inside the country, not demand and supply in labor markets. It's driven usually for the strong inflations by devaluation pressure because the institution behind becomes vulnerable.
Thank you, Dr. Sauer. And yes, I want to say that for most, if not all of this conversation, we are talking about hyperinflation. So 100% inflation, 200, 1,000, 10,000, a million percent inflation, prices doubling overnight. We are not talking about, consumer prices went up 8% in a year. We are talking about a very extreme. So Dr. Sauer, as promised, let's now go back 101 years to 1923, and we're talking about your very long 360-page paper, The Lessons from 1923 for the Euro Area, Enlightening the Dark Side of Insolvent Central Banks' Balance Sheets. So you're talking, as you said earlier, about Germany, Poland, Austria, and Hungary. So Austria, Hungary, Germany, the losers of World War I, they had a very large reparations payment imposed upon them by the rest of the world, by the Allies. A lot of people were on the gold standard in 1914. Most people went off it during World War I, and then in 1922, 23, it's countries are struggling to go back on the gold standard. And then also, Dr. Sauer, in economics, I think the classical thing is hyperinflation is caused by way too much money. So the quantity of money. The Reichsbank, the predecessor to the modern day Bundesbank, central bank in Germany, is just printing and printing all day. And that is what caused hyperinflation. The central bank, Reichsbank's governor, Rudy Havenstein, that is the narrative with which economists and monetary enthusiasts are familiar. Where does that fall short? And how do you introduce this concept of central bank insolvency that causes hyperinflation? And let's stick with Germany for now. We can go into the other countries later.
First, you mentioned we look at the very strong inflations, but also the heavy inflations. Inflation, if it's up to, let's say, 10, 20%, that can happen for other reasons: labor markets, supply, demand pull, cost push, demand pull effects. But if we range in 30, 40, 50%, and then there is no limit up to billions of percentages in a year, it's usually that the institution behind the central bank becomes vulnerable on foreign exchange markets. The mark in the 1920s in Germany devalued, and then suppliers simply demand more of this devalued currency, first for tradable goods, but then after some while, when the foreign currency or the black market rate of the foreign currency became some kind of a standard, yeah, because you sink already like you did in the 1920s in US dollars. And then it's just like the currency devalues, prices go up, right? Because all suppliers want more of this devalued currency for their products. Well, and that it happens in stages, and at the very beginning, obviously, like it was in Argentina in the last 10 years, and it's going to be in the euro area if this happens. Hopefully it doesn't. But if this happens at the beginning, all these supplier demand effects on markets probably are dominant at first, like they have been in the last year. But we are running the risk of an exchange rate driven, of a devaluation driven inflation, which then little by little becomes the dominant effect. And then there is no limit, right? So it can go up 100, 200, 300%, depending on the institution behind. It's the financial strength from the central bank. So now let's start with Germany, not in the 1920s, but in 1914, before the outbreak of World War I. And I try to explain it very simply with a simple mark note from January 1940, before the outbreak of World War I. And at that point in time, the mark was backed by gold, 1/3. The gold standard doesn't mean that the complete money supply is backed by gold. It's just some liquidity reserve the central bank holds. But mostly it was backed 2/3 by very stable, very valuable assets. And those at the time were commercial bills. This mark note did not change physically, let's say in 1920, but it lost at first until February 1920. So it lost a little bit of its external value, I'm referring to the exchange rate, and its internal value, I'm referring to the price level. It lost a little bit of its value already until the end of World War I in 2018.
Sorry, Dr. Sauer, but when did Germany go off gold? During World War I?
With the start of World War I.
Okay, very beginning, yeah.
The reserves are still there. And actually, during the war, these gold reserves increased slightly, right? But with war financing, the Reichsbank giving credit to the German government, and the government, war financing means the government just tells, well, after we win the war, we will pay it back, that credit. There was no inflationary effect. So we had a little bit of inflation until the end of the war. And also the mark slightly devalued against the dollar. The US stayed in the gold standard. But then from 1918, November 1918, end of the World War I, until February 1920, the mark devalued by a factor of over 10, right? This devaluation cannot be explained by a money supply increase. So the money supply increased at the outbreak of World War I, but later on it was a gradual, normal increase. But at the same time, between 1918 and 1920, we see a devaluation from the mark in the order of a factor of 10. And the price level increased by similar magnitudes. And therefore, if you really, and that's just a simple example, but I really analyzed the balance sheet, the asset side of the balance sheet, the financial strength, the assets from the central bank in more detail. But what happened actually, the Reichsbank lost from one day to the next, let's say, half of its gold reserves, which at the time were huge. Without any compensation, it lost half of its gold reserves. And therefore, the institution which backs that money, the backing of the mark, deteriorated. And therefore, we suffered the first wave of severe inflation in Germany. That's one simple example. So for enormous central bank losses, it had to do with the winter of 1919, 1920. And we had to import foodstuffs, and the government was not willing to get these foreign currency from other resources, and therefore it used the gold from the Reichsbank. So it lost half of its international reserves, which at the time were huge. The Reichsbank became vulnerable on foreign exchange market, and that was the first hard inflationary phase for Germany.
Thank you, Dr. Sauer. So you said commercial bills earlier. That is private notes issued by merchants and stuff, so private sector. And then we see foreign exchange, of course, you mean currencies, also known as, referred to it as FX. So that's fascinating that during World War I, inflation and Reichsmark's depreciation was bad, but it wasn't that bad. It really started after the war ended, from 1918 to 1919. When you say that they lost the gold reserves, was that just because foreign holders of Reichsmarks, which were backed by gold, were saying, hey, this Reichsmark is not what it used to be worth. I'm going to go to the Reichsbank and redeem it, or have someone do that for me. And so when you say they lost the gold reserves, the Reichsmarks lost the gold reserves. If someone redeems, if I have a Reichsmark note and I go to the Reichsbank to redeem it, yes, the bank has lost its gold reserve as an asset, but it's also lost a liability, right? So isn't it square?
No. So before 1920, the first inflationary or strong inflationary phase in Germany, they just lost the asset. It was not like it usually is, obviously, that it's either a balance sheet expansion when the central bank issues money, or it's a reduction of the complete balance sheet when money is redeemed. In that case, the Reichsbank had to give away half of its gold reserves to the Reich, to the German government, such that they could import foodstuffs, complicated winter after the war of 1919, 1920. So it lost an asset, an important asset, without any compensation.
Wow. So needless to say, this kind of violates a lot of modern day rules about central banking. Like the US government would never just take an asset from the,
yeah. I don't think it's going to happen in the near future in Europe, but in a different manner. Let's think about the next winter and energy imports here in Europe. And in a different manner, obviously, they can use the financial strength, the financing power of the central bank in order to import energy to Europe in such a scenario. And therefore, those hyperinflations are very eye-opening because the effects are clear, right? You can, like these central bank losses, they obviously they don't happen most of the time, but in the 1920s, after the First World War, with Germany facing such reparation payments, there you can really see, oh my goodness, it was the institution behind that money supply which I call insolvent. Again, it's not a legal insolvency, but it's a de facto insolvency on foreign exchange markets. And therefore, money was actually debased and lost its value externally on foreign exchange markets, but then obviously also internally, because at the end, what gives this note or gave this note value is institutional side of money, I call it, like the financial strength from the issuer. What I want to emphasize is that there is some backing of the currency. And actually, that's not a strange theory. It was like the main theory back then in the late 19th century called banking school. And the main reason for money being valued and being accepted by the public is simply that the issuer still has control over all that money supply and is able to redeem it, right? So having all these commercial bills and advances on collateral, that simply means that all that money issued and being used by the public has to be repaid. So a strong currency is based on the assets of the central bank, and to bring it to this example, it's based on repayment obligations, right? So each note in circulation issued because commercial bills had been discounted at the bank means like each note has to be paid back to the issuer, right? And that makes the central bank non-vulnerable. Nobody can speculate against such a currency. And therefore, it's accepted by the public. At the end, it's the backing of the currency which gives money value or valuation by the public. That changed during World War I to slide number 14. So during war financing,
Here we go. Okay.
the position of treasury bills became bigger, increased. And at very first, so we talked about after World War I, these treasury bills still had a market value. So they still represent repayment obligations, right? As long as the government is able to finance or to repay its debt, as long as markets believe, like there must be some kind of a market check, as long as markets believe that the government more or less, I calculated like the expected repayment probability with different bond prices, which are traded on different markets and so forth. But as long as these assets more or less have some value, the central bank is not really vulnerable. And what happened then when they lost other assets like gold during 1920 and again half of its gold holdings in 1923, and all these treasury bills became completely worthless, and then the Reichsbank was insolvent. There was no backing whatsoever of the money supply, only worthless treasury bills, which had no market price at the time because the Reichsbank was the only party willing to, they bought them up all. You can stabilize prices if you buy them up all, but if nobody else wants, if private markets are not willing to hold these bills, then they're worthless. Then we had to recapitalize the Reichsbank. So we had no currency reform in Germany, no real currency reform. And this mark again became backed by valuable assets in November 1923 because we recapitalized the Reichsbank. So what we did, that's the assets of the central bank, or the most important ones. What you see, the treasury bills here in red, they represented at the very moment when we stabilized the exchange rate in order to end inflation, they represented more than 90% of the Reichsbank balance sheet. But those treasury bills, as I mentioned, had no market value. So the Reichsbank could not defend the value of the mark on foreign exchange market. At that point in time, they decided to replace these worthless claims against the government by some valuable asset, the Rentenmark or the Rentenbank notes. Like they, via a forced mortgage on landed properties, they founded a different bank.
They printed a new currency. Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't a real legal tender, this Rentenmarks, but it was accepted by the public because also the Rentenbank was very solvent. They had as their main asset the claims on a forced mortgage on landed properties for commerce, banking, and so forth.
Backed by real assets. But Dr. Sauer, didn't the Rentenmark replace the Reichsmark?
No, not at all. So,
okay.
And that's a big miss. It happened at the same time. In all other countries, there was no such thing like a currency reform. The currency reforms happened later. In some countries, Hungary, 2.5 years after they recapitalized their central bank and after they stabilized the exchange rate. And in Germany, the confusion comes from that second currency being like part of the, it could be used as a means of payment, but it was not the legal tender and it was not defended on foreign exchange markets. So the stabilization was defending the value of the mark, yeah, at 2.5 trillion marks per dollar, but defending the value of the old mark, no currency reform at foreign exchange markets. At that very moment in time, this mark became again an accepted hard currency. Why? Because we replaced those worthless claims against the government by a valuable asset, here the Rentenmark. And additionally, the Reichsbank started to issue again exclusively against very stable and valuable assets, repayment obligations and commercial bills. This means that from that point in time, it was impossible to speculate against the Reichsbank, which some speculators tried. But as Schacht, like the main person in charge, like the president of the Reichsbank, who became president exactly at that point in time, as he explained later on, this speculation had to fail because there is no additional mark which you can short sell on these foreign exchange markets. So all the speculators, right, who speculate, the mark is going to devalue against the dollar, and they sell it on the forward markets. In a month from now, they have to show up with all these marks. But everybody else needed those marks to pay back their debt at the Reichsbank. And therefore, Schacht himself wasn't concerned about this speculation. He knew that it's going to fail because the Reichsbank was first recapitalized, which is very difficult, mostly because you have to do it at a point in time when you still the government still lacks access to international funding markets, right? So for that, they had to impose a mortgage on landed properties in Germany. But not only the central bank has to be recapitalized, then obviously monetary financing has come to an end, which means that the central bank again becomes a non-vulnerable institution, and all these attacks on the mark failed. But the mark itself physically, well, it had different denominations, but physically it never changed. And the main mistake in economics, but also like in our intuition, is that we think that this mark note was the same in 1914, was the same in 1920, and was the same after November 1923. No, it was not. It changed in this case, which we just saw, in a matter of days. Yeah, from a non-backed, completely worthless currency, not accepted by the public, again to a hard currency. As you see, like the assets increase massively because also the money supply increased in Germany 15-fold. after we stabilized the exchange rate and after by that stabilization, the hyperinflation from one day to the next was over.
So you're saying that the money supply exploded higher during the hyperinflation and maybe before it, but after the hyperinflation ended, after order was restored with the Rentenmark and the Reichsbank was restored and inflation went down, you're saying that the money supply still went higher.
Right. So before it was different magnitudes and so forth, but in all countries, and I'm also citing some paper from Thomas Sargent from 82, and he also realized in all these countries, Austria, Hungary, and so forth, the money supply tripled or increased sixfold after the exchange rate was stabilized and after the hyperinflation was over. And the price level was stable. In Germany, it was even actually a 50-fold increase because, usually he used the monthly data, but I did it a little bit more precise using the weekly data. But that money why could it increase so much? Because it was again accepted. Yeah, people are willing to hold that money. It's a stable currency from one day to the next. So physically, it did not change. And obviously, it's like all these wheelbarrows, like here in the slide, all these wheelbarrows, everybody, or it's the intuition, and that happened, unfortunately, even in economics. The intuition is, okay, it was the quantity of money which caused the inflation. Then the money supply stabilized. It did not. It increased 15-fold. But you don't see like the change at the institutional side of money, like the institution behind the central bank assets changed dramatically, as I showed. And it's not the same mark note. It's a different mark because it's backed again. And unfortunately, we did not notice this effect of the change in central bank assets, not for the hyperinflations themselves. Yeah, monetary financing has two effects. Money supply increases, and that one's observed. And therefore, we had the simple misleading theory, okay, more money, more inflation, yeah, like monetarism. But at the same time, if you do monetary financing, you give that money away to a broken government. So the central bank loses its financial strength. And what I showed that because there are more effects, like there are additional central bank losses, there are these recapitalizations. So at the end, it's really the change, the combined change. Therefore, I use the word solvency because it's really combining the balance sheet from the central bank. It's the combined change in money supply, yeah, which could be in one form or another a liability, yeah, if it's sold at foreign exchange markets. It's not a legal liability, but anyway, if the central bank wants to stabilize the exchange rate, it needs valuable assets. And they tried it during the hyperinflations all the time, as they did in Argentina in the last 10 years. So the vulnerability, the undercapitalization, together with the outstanding money supply, this combined information explains the hyperinflation for all four countries much better. So I constructed a time series which combines the complete balance sheet of the central bank and brings all this information together. Yeah, and that time series represents the solvency or the insolvency of the central bank. So you can explain better than the mere money supply, which is more like a accompanying symptom. You can explain much better the hyperinflations themselves, but you also can explain the recapitalizations because, as you see, the money supply increased 15-fold in Germany after the end of the hyperinflation.
Like gold did, Bitcoin is establishing itself as a macro asset that potentially helps hedge against the government devaluation of your money. Finally, you can easily access Bitcoin in a low-cost ETF with the VanEck Bitcoin Trust, ticker HODL. Search the ticker HODL in your brokerage app today.
Visit vaneck.com/HODLFG to learn more. That's vaneck.com/HODLFG. Now the disclosures. Investing involves risk and you could lose money on an investment in the VanEck Bitcoin Trust, also known as the Trust or HODL. The value of Bitcoin and therefore the value of the Trust shares could decline rapidly, including to zero. You could lose your entire principal investment. For a more complete discussion of the risk factors relative to the trust, carefully read the prospectus linked below. Thanks, let's get back to the interview.
So you show how an old Reichsmark used to be backed by commercial bills, so that's private notes, advances on collateral. You can tell us what that is. Gold and foreign exchange. Foreign exchange is foreign currency, dollars, francs, pounds, whatever, and treasury bills, which you show is quite small. So treasury bills would be the sovereign bonds or bills of the German government, the Reichsbank being the central bank of Germany, the German government being the German government, the fiscal, not the monetary. And so as now we have that switch where treasury bills, German government bills became a swelled and became a swollen outsized share of the assets on the Reichsmark's balance sheet. So my question is, what's going on with the treasury bills? How come treasury bills became so worthless? And likewise, if the assets of the Reichsbank are German government treasury bills denominated in Reichsmarks, and the liabilities are German paper currency, also known as Reichsmarks, wouldn't they devalue at the same time?
First, go to slide 61 to get like the balance sheets, like the typical positions from the 1920s. Actually, it was much more complicated for some countries with up to 15 positions. But anyway, so marked here with a different color are advances to the government, because at the end, those positions were complicated, right? Giving the government credit in one form or the other, in the case of the Reichsbank discounting treasury bills, they still, like they do right now in Argentina, they put some historical or nominal value. But obviously that's a fake value if you're only a party who's holding those bills and giving that nominal value to these bills. So in reality, what I calculated, in order to deflate the asset side from the central bank to its approximate market value, I checked for other bonds which were traded on markets, compared them to bonds from very solvent countries with the same coupon payment, same denominated in the same currency, and so forth. And then you can see what the market expectations for the probability that those government bonds are serviced. And this is slide number 63. For Germany, this measure before the outbreak of World War I, it's not in here right now, it was close to 1. So Germany, compared to a very solvent country, they're both kind of equal, and therefore, obviously Germany was solvent. And also my measure, which I call the solvency factor, the factor which I need to deflate the central bank claims against the government to their expected market value. Here, that's from the beginning of 1918, so more or less before the end of the war, we are down to like 70%, right? So actually all these claims from the central banks against the government, measured by market expectations, they're only worth more or less like 70%. And then we had several events. I'm referring here to a famous paper from Webb, who also did this mistake of explaining the German hyperinflation by the quantity of money, also some expectations. But anyway, it's like the version of the quantitative view, yeah. And I treat it in more than, in the literature review, in more than, 8, 9 pages for everybody who wants to read it. But then we had several events. So the terms of the Versailles Treaty became public, which was not very fortunate for Germany. Yeah. Then we had some effort, some finance reforms, which he labeled already, and I took that label, good fiscal news. So the Erzberger finance reform. If you look at my measure, it becomes slightly better. And at the same time, I put the percentage of treasury bills held by the public. And that's also an important share. It's the percentage share of the private markets still being willing to hold these treasury bills. And as you see at the end in 1923, nobody holds these treasury bills.
Wasn't the Erzberger reforms, was he not assassinated?
Yes. And probably
So not
even
good for the currency. No.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, there is a famous saying of Erzberger, like, the bullet for me is already made. Yeah. And
Jeez.
yeah, exactly. So this anecdote also shows why it's so difficult at that point in time to reform the state finances in order not being dependent on the printing press from the central bank. Because if you are in such a situation, like Erzberger was already in that at that time, the reforms you need in order to stabilize public finances and therefore at the end the currency, the reforms are very, very severe. So at the end, when we stabilize the exchange rate, they fire 25% of public servants, right? And additionally, you have to raise taxes. Yeah. And additionally, they had to impose a forced mortgage. Like it's right now in Argentina. That's the story of Milei trying to, at the end, also to recapitalize the central bank. The two measures, yeah, the willingness of the market to hold this short-term treasury bills and the market price or the expected repayment probability from longer German government bonds, the blue line, they, after the Reparation Commission announced the payment schedule, which
And when was that? When did they announce the payment schedule? 1921.
yeah, exactly, April 21. And yeah, the Germans expected that probably they give us more time to pay, and hopefully we don't have to pay the complete reparations. And it did not turn out. So that was very bad fiscal news, actually. And then the worst of it all, there was no such thing like an international rescue facility for Germany. And finally, that was decided here from bankers, mainly JP Morgan, to not give credit to Germany to restore its finances, right? And then, like, Germany did not pay all tranches. The French and Belgium occupied the Ruhr region, which was our industrial heartland at the time. And then the willingness of the market to hold those treasury bills disappear. So the Reichsbank can stabilize the price of these treasury bills by buying up them all, yeah, which they did. They were discounted at the central bank, at the Reichsbank. And also my measures, which measures the repayment probability of the Reichs with different bond markets, which were still traded, like approached zero. Yeah, so the Reichsmark was completely insolvent. Therefore, the central bank was completely insolvent. At the point of stabilization, like, these treasury bills were not worth a penny. The Reichsbank was completely insolvent, not able to defend the exchange rate whatsoever. And then they decided to recapitalize the central bank, but in such a situation, when you lack access to international funding markets, that is a really difficult task. And I think we need some research about these recapitalization. We have to establish some recapitalization research for central banks in order to be prepared, because in a similar manner, like it's more or less the case right now in Argentina, it could happen in the euro system as well. It's not comparable to the hyperinflations, obviously, but these hyperinflations, because the contour lines are easier to understand, yeah, because there you can really easily see that actually central banks became insolvent and had to be recapitalized. And also we can learn it was 4 different recapitalizations, right? The situation was quite different in Austria and Hungary. Yeah, we have to understand these mechanics in order to don't get into this situation of a central bank insolvency, and also in order to be prepared.
I just want to reiterate for our audience. So on this chart, we are showing in the orange line the percentage of German treasury bills that are held by the public when there is a demand to hold treasury bills that supports the currency.
Right, and the rest is held by the Reichsbank.
So that's the orange line. And then the blue line is going down in a very similar fashion, matching it with a few discrepancies. The solvency factor, which is an equation that you have that's very complicated. I'm not going to pretend I understand it, but what does that solvency factor measure? Or you said earlier, it is the percentage that you think people holding the treasury bill will be paid back. But explain what you mean by paid back. Wasn't the chance that they would be paid back 100%, even if they were paid back in worthless paper currency, they still would be technically paid back, right?
Yeah, this measure, the blue line, I used to deflate the claims from the central bank against the government. Yeah, and the government can always pay in its own currency and so forth. But I measured the difference between foreign bonds traded at that time in Germany. I had to switch markets, but anyway, like for that time, German long-term government bonds compared to government bonds from a solvent country. Yeah. And if you take the same denomination, the same currency, same coupon payment, and similar maturity, still the German bonds traded at the long-term bonds, right, traded at a much lower value as the foreign bonds being denominated in the same currency.
As a macro 101, financial markets might say that the forward market would be priced, not that this concept was necessarily developed at the time, but the forward market would be pricing in rapid Reichsmark's devaluation against the dollar or other currencies or gold. So that would imply maybe that interest rates would have to be spectacularly high. What were interest rates doing in Germany at this time? I mean, if inflation is 1 billion%, is the interest rate at 1 billion%? Where is there a maximum on that? What was going on with interest rates?
So also a German bond traded in London became worthless. Yeah. So this pledged coupon payments in pound sterling became worthless. So I'm pretty sure that at the end, the Reichsbank, the Reich was insolvent, measured long-term German bonds compared to the same currency and so forth on the same market to a different, more solvent country, and also the German bonds traded in London lost its complete value. Yeah, or almost its complete value. Now, interest rates. So the Reichsbank did raise the discount rate, which at the time was like the main interest rate for the central bank, very late. So we already suffered very strong inflations, but they never adjusted the interest rate for discounting at the Reichsbank. But interest rates, obviously, with inflation increased. Slightly always later, like reacting to this inflationary phases. And some very important story, which I have to tell you if you go to slide 44. So for interest rates and for the forward markets, yeah, the mark being traded against pound sterling and so forth, Germany is also a very interesting case because it wasn't a continuous devaluation of the mark. So here you see the red line, that's the exchange rate index, New York and Berlin. So obviously I took the New York market because it cannot be controlled by the German government. It's not a fake exchange rate, it's a real market exchange rate. So this is marks per dollars, and an increase means a devaluation, right? And then you have wholesale prices. Also an increase means a price increase from this wholesale price index, and you have the money supply. And I indexed all of these curves in order to show like their relative percentage increases to the end of World War I in November 1918. And the first devaluation, which we see, I mentioned already, that is the mark lost 90% of its dollar value. Yeah, it depreciated, it was worth only 1/10 or less than 1/10 of the dollar compared to the end of the war. And the price level increases and the money supply does not really react. But then what I want to mention right now, and therefore with the forward markets and with interest rates, it's more confusing that you think, because then the mark gained value. This was the time of the Erzberger reforms we talked about, and it appreciated by 100%, right? So this is an indexed measure here, an indexed slide, but if I remember well the number, so we came down from 70 marks per dollar, something like that, of 80 marks per dollar to 40 marks per dollar, right? It appreciated in between, right? And now it also enforces my argument quite a bit. The second time, if you can go back to the slide, the second time that the Reichsbank lost half of its gold holdings, they reduced for the first time. In February 1920, when the red line first peaks, why that happened? Because the Reichsbank became vulnerable on foreign exchange market. It lost half of its gold holdings, had to pay it out to the Reich, get no compensation. And then the next green circle, between February 23 and April 23, the Reichsbank stabilized the exchange rate against all stable foreign currencies. Actually, if you stabilize the exchange rate, let's say to pound sterling, you stabilize it against all stable foreign currencies. Here is the exchange rate in relation to the dollar. The price level also stabilizes. Like we had even a small appreciation of the mark, and the price level follows suit by more or less actually the same magnitude. But the money supply keeps increasing because monetary financing was still going on. How could they stabilize the exchange rate? They'd ship gold to London, right? Using this gold as collateral to get pound sterling in order to stabilize the exchange rate. So people buy marks, and the Reichsbank, via loan, handed out pound sterling, or dollars, but using up all its gold reserves. So a few months later, when this collateralized gold was lost for this 2-3 months stabilization, the Reichsbank became even more insolvent. So it lost half of its remaining gold reserves in a matter of 2 or 3 months in order to stabilize the exchange rate, because at that point in time, politicians in Germany already understood that the only way to end inflation, right, is to stabilize the exchange rate. And Havenstein, president of the Reichsbank at that time, later said, yeah, obviously we knew that's not going to work out for a long time. He was surprised that it worked out for 2.5 months. But anyway, he was forced, let's say, by the German government to at least bring inflation down for 2 or 3 months, such that the passive resistance from the population, which had to do with the occupation of the Ruhr area, could be maintained. But you can temporarily, if you don't recapitalize the central bank and so forth, temporarily by using up your reserves, you can stabilize the price level via stabilizing the exchange rate. But at the end, the huge devaluation which happened afterwards, you are much worse off. So that's a second important reason for the dramatic devaluation the mark faced afterwards. Here you see it like this measure in black, which I calculated, which shows the solvency or the insolvency of the Reichsbank. And as I mentioned before, like the first increase, again, it's a logarithmic scale. So the first real devaluation of the mark, now the exchange rate being the blue line.
Sorry, when on the x-axis it says June 12th, October 13th. What years are this? What are we talking about? 1923?
Yes, but the first strong devaluation I mentioned before was until February 1920, and there you see that the exchange rate, now in blue, really devalues. Again, going up means a devaluation by a factor of 10. And the price level follows suit, but this was preceded by the black line, and that's the measure I calculated for the Reichsbank's insolvency, right? Because it takes into account the gold losses, it takes into account that the claims from the Reichsbank against the government also lost in value. And therefore, if you take into account these huge gold losses for the winter from 1990 to 1920, then actually it makes sense, right? That the mark devalued so strongly. Probably you can go to slide, because it's somehow easier to see, to slide 73. Those are exactly the same lines, but here I start earlier. Is the complete time series I could gather with the available data. And as we have seen before, now it's indexed a little bit different, because I indexed all 4 curves at the stabilization of the exchange rate in November 1923, and therefore the money supply seems to be different, but we look about percentage changes, right? So there is no harsh increase in the money supply. It's a gradual increase at that time, when in November 1920, February 1920, the mark first severely devaluated on foreign exchange market. The price level severely increased. And that was preceded by, now in blue, this measure. I combined the complete information from the balance sheet of the Reichsbank. And here the gold losses enter the equation. And later on, if you see, all these curves stabilize after the stabilization in November 1923. Yeah, the central bank again becoming insolvent, as we have seen with the representation of its balance sheet. And the money supply keeps increasing. This was this 15-fold increase we have seen before. And if you do the econometrics, yeah, if you check for which of these curves are correlated or actually co-integrated, because that was unit root processes over here, no matter, but the word correlation is fine to us. If you do the econometrics, then, as we can see, for example, in slide 78, so stars means co-integration, right? Or correlation, let's say. And here you see that this measure, the solvency exchange rate, likely determined the exchange rate. That is my hypothesis. If you go to the table, to the last entry for Germany, you see this 3 stars, yeah, meaning that the p-value here is below 1%. So we can be quite sure that there was a real correlation or co-integration between this measure of which shows the solvency of the central bank and the actual exchange rate, and the money supply or the exchange rate is not correlated.
Dr. Sauer, I was never particularly strong in econometrics, but let me ask you. So I thought what was hurting the solvency rate was the depreciation in the exchange rate. In other words,
it's the other. Yeah, it's the other way around. So the central bank losing assets, right? Either the gold losses or the market value. From its claims against the government.
But isn't that market value just pricing in forward mark depreciation against dollars and francs?
No, in this case, when I measured the respected repayment probability from the Reich, I used bonds from Germany versus bonds from another country, which are denominated in the same market, traded at the same stock exchange, and so forth. Yeah, so we don't have to care about this exchange rate effect.
So sorry, are you saying gold marks? So gold bonds that are denominated, like, what are you being paid back? Are you being paid back gold at the end of the day, or are you being paid back fiat currency like francs?
Either marks, but look, it's all these. Obviously, the government, when it wants to, can always pay back devalued marks and print as much as they want to. But if they completely devalue their currency until it's completely worthless, that's not obvious. Yeah, probably, as they did at some point, they stabilized the exchange rate, and still, obviously, a German bond, denominated in marks, doesn't have the same value as, in this case, it was a Romanian bond, because Romania was much more solvent, much more likely to pay back. And also for German bonds being traded in London, in this case, pound sterling, completely lost their value. So the central bank, by losses of its twice, it lost half of its international reserves without being compensated, and also the Reich becoming insolvent. The central bank became insolvent. During these, if you remember the first, which we have seen at the slide, the first devaluation in November 1920. In February 1920, there it was not the German bonds losing their value. There it really was the gold losses, or mainly the gold losses, which made the central bank vulnerable I have a measure right now where I combine all this information from the balance sheet. The central bank is vulnerable. It cannot defend the exchange rate. I calculated the exchange rate which the central bank, which with its remaining assets, can defend. And then the real exchange rate adjusted. And this we can see here in this time series comparison or this co-integration analysis. So I did that here, for example, for the relation between the measure I calculated for the central bank solvency, insolvency, undercapitalization, and the exchange rate, because in my view, in my theory, a vulnerable central bank leads to a devaluated currency, leads later on to price increases. If you go to slide 77, and let's take the last example again from Germany. Again, you see like this 3 stars representing co-integration or correlation now between the exchange rate and the price level. First, I showed that the solvency measure from the central bank is related to the exchange rate. An insolvent central bank means a devaluation of the exchange rate because it became vulnerable. And now we can also show that this exchange rate is correlated or co-integrated to the price level, because the next step in this hypothesis is, well, once the mark devalued on foreign exchange markets, the suppliers demand more of these devalued currency for their products, and therefore the prices increase, right? And if you now look for the typical or for the misleading or the leading theory in economics, they claim that the money supply determined the price level, but they're not even correlated or co-integrated. Yeah, there are different studies. So if you stop at 1923, November 1923, you may get a co-integration with a significance level of 10%. But as I showed you, the money supply keeps increasing, prices are stable, and therefore these curves don't co-integrate or are not correlated anymore. So as I used a bigger time span, then the money supply is not at all, not even at a 10% significant level, co-integrated or correlated with the price level. So there is no evidence that the money supply itself, and its multiplication during the hyperinflation caused the price increases, caused inflation. And I think we can, if we bring the central bank, which represents not only the money supply increases, but also the losses or the recapitalization on its asset side. If we bring a vulnerable central bank into the equation, we can explain what really took place. So in very simplified terms, but that is mainstream economics. And even in the specialized textbooks, you never...
Wait, Dr. Sauer, can I try my best to explain it? So what we're seeing here is a equation, a series of events. So M goes up, money supplies goes up, demand on goods goes up because there's more money to chase goods. Goods are denominated in prices, P, so the prices goes up. And then via purchasing power parity, which I'll be honest, I don't fully understand, then the FX devalues. So Germany prints a bunch of money, the prices of German goods in marks goes up, and then via purchase power price parity, then the mark devalues against the dollar and gold and other stuff.
Right. And PPP, historically, it comes from the idea, well, if that money lost its value internally, because I cannot buy goods anymore, it should be that I cannot buy foreign goods. And therefore, it has to devalue against the same currency. In economics, this relation is called the law of one price. But in economics, we had this chain, right? First, domestic sphere, from money supply increases to domestic price increases. So first, money loses its internal value. And then, since this money cannot buy goods anymore, it also cannot buy foreign goods, and therefore they establish PPP. which is a little bit more difficult to understand because we're losing competitiveness with the domestic price increases, and therefore our goods are not demanded, and we demand more foreign goods, and then you have different demand for the currencies, and therefore the currency devalues. But historically, it comes from that idea, money being worthless inside the country, it has to be worthless outside the country. For all hyperinflations, all of these three variables changed more or less together. Not exactly, as we have seen right now, but more or less together. So the money supply increased by a factor of 1 trillion in Germany, the prices as well in a similar magnitude, and the mark was worth only 1 to a trillion in US dollars. But next slide, 29. What is the causality? And economists established a very reasonable, or at first a very reasonable causality, going from like the closed economy. It happens inside the country, money supply goes up, and then it loses its value in terms of goods. The relation between money and goods, like this idea of the quantity theory of money, is very old. Scarcity and so forth, neutrality of money, to mention some strong paradigms. And then the exchange rate. But if you think a second time, and if you look at the central bank, which might be important, and here I put the asset side of the central bank, which was never analyzed, with a few exceptions, all mentioned in my paper. But in mainstream economics, this was, or even in general in economics, the central bank asset side was never analyzed. Therefore, I call it the dark side of the central bank. If we bring the central bank into the equation, we come to the next slide, 30, and we realize, actually the central bank became insolvent. And now we look at the three variables again, going to the next slide, how we can probably combine these three variables together such that they moved or they correlated, as I mentioned before. Probably it was the increase in money supply, and the effect was not primarily on goods markets, like money has to chase goods, in the famous phrase from Milton Friedman. No, probably money chased dollars because the central bank became insolvent. People are not willing to hold this money again as a store of value. They want a different money, a stable money. They exchange their marks back in the 1920s to dollars. The exchange rate devalues, and since for everybody, completely obvious, like now in Argentina, or the last 10 years in Argentina, everybody as a reference point, they look at the black market exchange rate. In Argentina, that's called dollar blue. Once the black market exchange rate, which the government cannot control, there is no type of regulation which works to control this exchange rate. Once the mark, or let's say the Argentine pesos, becomes worthless, devalues, all suppliers react and increase their prices. And if you check econometrically, which order of events, which is more likely by this co-integration checks, which time series are correlated and or co-integrated and which are not, you find very strong arguments. And obviously we did a very simplified version over here, but for everybody who wants to read my paper, you find very, very strong arguments for this chain of causality. And actually, all hyperinflations, we talked only about the German case so far, but all hyperinflations ended exactly in the same manner. They recapitalized the central bank such that they could, as demonstrated over here, fix the exchange rate, to the US dollar in most countries, but in Hungary, they fixed the exchange rate to the pound sterling. And the League of Nations, which later became the United Nations, the League of Nations assisted in these financial reforms necessary to recapitalize the central bank and thereby to stabilize the exchange rate. And they completely understood that is the only way to end a hyperinflation. as you see on the next slide, they also noticed, obviously, the money supply increase after the exchange rate and the price level had been stabilized, but there was no concern whatsoever. I quote, "In fact, while maintaining the external value of the krone by the free sale of foreign exchange at a stable rate in relation to pound sterling, the bank also kept internal prices reasonably stable to the note issuing policy. Even so," that's the quote from before, "the money supply increased here with a factor of 3, I think." They were completely aware that the money supply itself, it's not the problem. Yeah, it's the backing of money. It's the two relations together, how much money is in circulation, and if that money is backed or not by valuable assets, such that the central bank is not vulnerable, such that it can stabilize the exchange rate. If so, we don't have to care. There is no threat of any inflation.
The orthodox way of thinking this in economics is more money causes prices to go up, which causes devaluation of the currency. You say, no, no, no. It actually is more money causes the exchange rate to depreciate, which itself causes prices to rise. Professor, I imagine a lot of this depends upon when we talk about the money supply going up, what are we talking about them literally pranking out paper bills of, with 20 mark note, 50 mark notes? Are we talking about bank deposits? Are we talking about the Reichsbank, as in the case of the Federal Reserve, increasing bank reserves, quantitative easing or something like that? And then the German private banks are then printing bank deposits and sort of, passing that along to the customer. For example, in the United States and in Europe, the bank balance sheets exploded in 2008 and 2009 via quantitative easing. At the time, before my time, but at the time, a lot of people thought that would be inflationary. We now know those are somewhat inert bank reserves. Like you and I cannot touch a ECB bank reserve. I cannot touch a Federal Reserve bank reserve.
Yeah,
Only JP Morgan can. And the impact on that on the real economy is somewhat muted. So you talked about the thin air on the asset side of the Reichsbank, but when you talk about the money supply exploding higher, was it mostly paper currency? And then how did that go to weaken the FX? Because I imagine if it's just paper currency, go to the shop and buy bread, that would cause the prices to go up before FX. However, if it's mostly merchants using Reichsmarks to buy, coal from France or some other place, then that would cause depreciation. And also, let's all introduce the elephant in the room, which is the 138, 150 billion. You tell me, German gold mark reparations, which was a huge negative asset just thrown upon Germany, which kind of required all of this money printing, and that you had to print a lot of M in order to meet that liability. So tell us about what was the money supply that increased, and what was the composition of it? How did it cause depreciation in FX?
Okay, very good point. So if I speak about money, I always mean central bank money, which is notes in circulation. And additionally, probably we go a balance sheet, a simplified balance sheet on slide 64, and additionally deposits at the central bank. So this is a little bit confusing for all folks who never had this, like different monetary aggregates, M0, M1, and so forth. I always mean M0, or in Milton Friedman's words, high-powered money or central bank money. We can imagine all the central bank money as notes in circulation, but there is an electronic version of notes in circulation because private banks do have a central bank account and do have a deposit at the central bank, because when they transfer in between, like the big banks, then obviously it doesn't make sense to exchange physical notes and there is one transporter going from one building to the next. No, when there is a transaction on the interbanking market in central bank money, in real currency, in M0, then obviously that happens electronically from one account to the other. But that is central bank money, and I only talk about central bank money. That's the only one I'm interested, not other like bank money and M1 and so forth, because central bank money is traded on foreign exchange market. We can easily, again, imagine those illegal foreign exchange markets, like in the last 10 years, if you went to Buenos Aires, and you go with dollars, you go with cash dollars or cash euros, and then you exchange, and for sometimes you got double the price than exchanging for the official exchange rate. You exchange it in an exchange office or with some guy in the street, in the main shopping street in Buenos Aires called Florida. You exchange central bank money. Well, you can buy forwards and so forth, but at the end, it's settled in central bank money. Foreign exchange markets mean a settlement in central bank money.
In central bank denominated money, but I think is
No.
in foreign exchange, it's just no.
No, at the end.
Like now, I think if you trade, short the euro, long the euro against the dollar, it will be with your broker, but it's not through interbank market.
But in the end, you can, it could be a forward or a future or whatsoever. But at the end, it's traded from your whoever, it's traded in central bank money, electronically, because there is one party which does have. It could even have an account at the ECB denominated in dollars. When they do a currency swap, which they in 2012, I think it was, once did in order to give liquidity in dollars to European commercial banks. So there were several currency swaps between the Fed and the ECB. And then the ECB can give in central bank money credit to those European banks, which before borrowed at the LIBOR market, dollars, like the euro dollar market, the dollar market outside the US, but also at the final stage in central bank money. This bank money, it's very confusing because people mix it up together. Bank money, like what we have on our bank account, it's a completely different type of money. Actually, what it is, it's only a claim I have against the commercial bank, right? And if I pay via a check or a transaction, this claim I do have against my commercial bank is transferred to the account from the guy who sold me a product to his bank account, and his bank the next day, receives in central bank money because those banks change their accounts at the central bank. He receives that his bank receives the money on the next day. There is a settlement in between, and there are many transactions going back and forth. But final settlement usually could be also that there is no final settlement because there is credit building up between those two banks. But at the end, the settlement usually takes place. So what we have as bank money, what we call money, it's not central bank money, and you are not able to buy with that claims you have against your bank. You're not able to buy dollars, except your bank or the branch of banks it belongs to. But let's say your bank is able to pay in dollars, right?
Dr. Sauer, so when you talk about M0 base money, there are two components, and forgive me for I have an American perspective. We have in the blue line, we have currency in circulation, so those are dollars, which are the liability of the Federal Reserve, and those are paper currency. So this was the chart that went parabolic in 1922 in Germany. What we have in the red is the settlement layer, bank reserves, which are the assets of commercial banks and the liabilities of the central bank, the Federal Reserve. Those are used to settle, which is what you just referred to. But was it the paper? What caused the explosion in the money supply? Was it mostly paper money, the blue line, or was it bank reserves, the settlement type of money, in the red line? What in Germany?
For the 1920s, because we live in a less electronic world, for the 1920s, it's mostly, let's say 80%. It's mostly notes in circulation, real paper money, and let's say 10 to 20% additionally, but relatively stable all the time, deposits from a commercial bank at the central bank. And they exist for the reason I try to explain, that different transfers can be settled not physically in notes, but can be settled more effectively one bank transferring accounts, its deposit at the central bank, but this is equal to central bank. It's equal to paper money in its electronic version to another bank. Back in the 1920s, it's all about the, let's say 80, 90%, it's all about the notes in circulation, right? And the money supply, which I showed you, represents notes in circulation because that's the typical measure everybody uses. When I calculated the backing of money, I added those 10 or 20% of deposits because they also represent central bank money. If you see, probably you want to go to how I calculated the solvency or the insolvency of the respective central bank, you can go to slide 65. And there I...
Over my head.
Yeah, no, but it's the sums are only because they're in real balance sheet data, you have like sub-positions. But if you look at the first animal over there, MT, like there was only, that's one we talked about, your blue line. So this is really notes in circulation, physical money, but actually central bank money, it's a little bit more because it's all these deposits and they had sub-accounts and therefore I had to index them again and sum them up. But this is central bank money. And then comes net private sector claims, mostly advances and bills, but also the sum of all other assets from the private sector minus the liabilities the central bank has from time to time. So this is the net private sector claims, which I don't devalue. I take these numbers as given, and also the central banks never suffered losses for those claims against the private sector. But then come the claims against the government, and those claims are devalued by the solvency factor and therefore deflating the balance sheet to its market value. So from all central bank money, from all notes outstanding, how much of these notes the central bank can redeem with its assets, denominated in the domestic currency, and divided by net international reserves. So the formula is simply all notes in circulation plus this deposits 10%, but all central bank money, how much money you can redeem with your assets in domestic currency, and the rest has to be redeemed if you want to defend an exchange rate with your remaining international reserves in dollars, or your net international reserves in dollars. And that should be more or less a good approximation for the defendable exchange rate, for the exchange rate the central bank really could defend. It's highly correlated or correlated with the real exchange rate, which makes this hypothesis of a central bank becoming vulnerable, and therefore we see devaluation, and in the end the price level increases, which make this hypothesis very likely.
Let's return to the issue of the huge foreign debt from reparations. I think an argument made very popular by economist John Maynard Keynes in Consequences of the Peace was that the size of the reparations was so unwieldy that it basically doomed the German economy, and that hyperinflation or depression was somewhat inevitable. Obviously, I'm paraphrasing my limited understanding of his argument. Do you agree with this? In other words, if you had the best monetary minds, the central bank geniuses and macro savants all in a room, and they were trying to run the German Reichsbank from 1920 to 1924, was it anything possible other than this hyperinflation? Because I mean, how do you try and pay over 100 billion gold marks when that's, I don't know how large that is to the GDP at the time, but it must have been huge, right?
Yeah. So, but Keynes' argument, if I remember well, was also that will cause also other consequences, like political consequences, and probably even like the later on what happened in 1933 is somewhere already in Keynes' writings, right? The German right, the right-wing parties, which were, and there were some popular economists at the time, one of the leaders of that right-wing party, bringing that argument all the time, that the mark had to devalue. There was no other way than to use marks to buy up dollars and to pay for the reparation payments, and there is no guilt whatsoever for the German Reichsbank. I don't think it's the case, and several times when it was still possible, it was, if you really tax people and if you really, and there was opportunities to pay the reparation payments without forcing the central bank to monetary finance the government at the same time, was possible, but obviously politically completely unpopular, right? So under the political circumstances, it's probably correct that at least strong inflation could not be avoided in Germany. But several times, I think they choose completely the wrong path, and they could have much less inflation if they appreciate from the very beginning to keep the Reichsbank as solvent as possible in such a situation. I'm not sure about the one winter I showed you in 1919-1920. As I understand from the literature, it was possible to pay for these food imports in dollars, in international reserves, even without sacrificing the gold from the Reichsbank, but by imposing severe taxes or some kind of enforced payment on the general public or on commerce and banking and so forth. Then the other gold losses, which contributed in 1923, they were completely stupid, because they used up this gold to stabilize the exchange rate for 2.5 months. That was a huge mistake. And the reparation payments, difficult, but probably by imposing all these necessary taxes, probably possible. But obviously, the situation was difficult, and Germany is not the only example. Other countries faced similar problems. Poland not, because it came into existence after World War I. But Hungary and Austria were also burdened with some reparation payments and territorial losses, and therefore it's not a single political mistake, but all these countries suffered from hyperinflation. But in Germany, they did a lot of additional mistakes.
Let's go back to the Rentenmark. Tell us, how was that currency or asset created, and how is it tied to real assets? How did that improve that?
They founded a second central bank, not which was called the Rentenbank, not a real central bank, because the only legal tender remained to be the German mark, and the Reichsbank the only real central bank. But in order to recapitalize the Reichsbank, you need some kind of a credit, right? And in order to stop monetary financing, you have to not only to cut the budget, to raise taxes and so forth, because that works after 2 or 3 months. But for the first 2 or 3 months, when you still have to pay for your public employees, you need some kind of a credit, right? And in Austria and Hungary, with the assistance of the League of Nations and this international community, they could issue bonds on international markets, and therefore they received this bridging credit or this bridging loan. First, to recapitalize the central bank. Second, to pay for your public employees until the budgetary reforms work. The austerity programs and raising taxes, and until you have a balanced budget and you don't need the printing press to pay your public employees. So in Germany, there was no help from foreign countries, and therefore they had to arrange, and people were not willing to give any credit to the German government. Impossible. They tried, right? A gold-denominated bond, or let's say a dollar-denominated bond it was, but it failed badly. And therefore, you had to impose a forced mortgage on landed properties of commerce, banking, and so forth, essentially all German companies. And you had to create this loan by yourself, an imposed loan, right? And with that loan, with that forced mortgage, all these companies being obliged in the next 20 years, even longer, to pay back this forced mortgage, that is an asset for the Reich or for the Rentenbank with that asset, with that created capital. It represents only future payments, but anyway, it's you can capitalize it now and today. With that asset, the Rentenbank could issue this Rentenmarks, which were backed by that asset, and it gave 1,200 million gold marks of credit in this newly introduced currency Rentenmark to the Reich, and the Reich used 200 million of this Rentenmark to recapitalize the Reichsbank. First, they wanted to use 300, but then they used 200 only. And the rest was used for this bridging, like the bridging loan to pay your government employees for the first 2 or 3 months. I simplified, but that's more or less what happened. And the people who were forced to pay those mortgages, became later on, stockholders from the Rentenbank, let's put it like this. But at first, so they suffered, If nobody wants to give you credit, you cannot issue any bond, you cannot, and raising taxes and all of that, you have to wait for your budget to balance, and therefore, you have to impose some kind of a enforced mortgage or something like that, which was not necessary in Austria and Hungary. And very interestingly, in Austria and Hungary, they also sold stocks from their central banks, in Poland as well, because the central bank has the monopoly of the note issue, and therefore it will have profits, in the near future. And these profits,
Seniorage, because it can issue paper at zero.
Exactly. And well, you can check for the Federal Reserve, for example, its income statement, And these profits are distributed to the stock owners, but like now for the European countries, they're completely distributed, or not completely, but if not put into the equity position, they're distributed to the states, And the states in Austria and Hungary, they sold most of this right to get profits from the seniorage from the central bank to private investors. That's also a possibility to recapitalize a central bank, but it's very limited. It's not as much as you may think, because it's a few percentage every year only. So seniorage is not the profit from issuing money. If they issue $1 billion, no, it's only the few percent you earn by issuing this $1 billion.
Yeah, so what you're referring to, I'm actually mistaken. It's not actually seniorage. Is that it costs a lot less than $100 to print a $100 bill. You're referring to the fact that a central bank can issue currency that yields zero to buy assets that yield something greater. And when you have a normally upward sloping yield curve, it's going to pay short-term assets and it's going to earn more on longer-term assets. Interestingly, the Federal Reserve is actually losing money right now because we have an inverted yield curve. That's neither here nor there.
Okay, one more with the yield curve. So normally central banks manage the yield curve only at the short side. Why? Because they're not willing to take all that liquidity risk, right? So that's a task for the financial markets, Let private banks take that liquidity risk, is borrowing short, lending long, and make this maturity transformation. But why should the central bank do it? No, they manage the yield curve at the very short end because they don't want to touch any risk at all. That is a normal central bank policy. And why? Historically, institutionally, because it's more or less very clear that if you take too many risky assets in your balance sheet, at the end you can become vulnerable, insolvent in a certain sense, and you debase the currency. And therefore, central banking usually means all banking is a swap of IOUs, but anyway, in order to issue money, they give short-term credit or they buy short-term government bills, and leaving the risky long-term yield transformation to the private sector.
Right. Thank you for that. You're absolutely right that in a classical sense, central banks don't operate at the long end of the yield curve, but under yield curve control or quantitative easing, they do.
Exactly. And in Europe, they did it. Lord, probably that's a nice. We can switch to come to the euro system. So what we did in Europe at first, when the European debt crisis started, in 2009, there were problems already with Greek government bonds. But in May 2010, we had the first rescue facility to rescue Greece. And what the central banks did at the same time was first not giving credit to commercial banks only for a few weeks, like it was before, the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. No, they were giving credit long-term for 3 years, such that these commercial banks maybe buy the Greek government bonds and the Portuguese government bonds, which are longer term to bring this yield curve down. But it wasn't enough. So the central banks themselves, the European central banks, started to buy crisis countries' government bonds. The first program, the SMP program, only crisis countries' government bonds. And then after some German Supreme Court decisions, now they are buying from all countries' government bonds which participate in the euro. But still, in order to buy crisis countries' government bonds, in order to stabilize prices, and they go for different maturities to bring these interest rates for those countries down. And now we are in a different, and in the US, you had also like the Federal Reserve being a market maker, but your problem was more the mortgage-backed security. So the Fed became not a lender of last resort. I like the wording from, I don't know if you know Perry Merling.
Yep. I've interviewed him. Yeah.
You interviewed him. Nice. So I took some MOOC lectures from Perry, because he's one of the few guys who really explains the institutional evolution of central banks and so forth. And I like the wording for the Fed's intervention back then of the Fed being the dealer of last resort, for the mortgage-backed securities, right? But that was also like, as in Europe for government bonds, it was also the Fed was used as a market maker to stabilize prices. And here we used the euro system as a market maker to stabilize bond prices. But every time, like now, they are loaded up, these national European central banks, with all these government bonds. And my concern is, if those government bonds devalue, we will see something like on slide 81.
You got a smile on your face. Okay, what's this?
Okay, or probably first 80. Since it's an old presentation, it's not updated, but more or less the central bank, the consolidated balance sheet, the combined balance sheet of all central banks which issue the euro looks like that. So first of all, the ECB is not a central bank, right? It's more like the headquarter where the presidents of the national central banks meet and they take decisions. And the executive board from the ECB also has some voting power, more or less 25%. But in general, when I explain it to my students, I put it very like such that they really get this differentiation between the ECB, and we are a system of central banks and the ECB is just the headquarter in the middle. So I tell them it's the building where we meet to make decisions.
It's interesting. I never heard of that. Is that different from the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, which is kind of the boss of the 12, I believe, Federal Reserve regional banks? Like when you say the Fed has, trillions and trillions of treasuries and agency mortgage-backed securities, most of that is in New York. So couldn't you say that the same about the Fed?
Because you are a nation. Okay. Back then, I think it's even like the consequences, the differences are even more severe, because the Federal Reserve System, well, it's also a system of central banks, and you do have 12 district banks, Federal Reserve banks, And there is also credit between those district banks called ISA balances in the US. But those credits from the very first time, actually it goes back to, that was also nicely explained by Perry Merling. It goes back to the banking associations, or the clearinghouse associations. The most important one being the New York Clearinghouse Associations. It was private banks, which make an association in order to solve a liquidity problem. Everybody has to pay out gold, or reserves. At that point in time. In the US, you called it lawful money, but you can imagine like gold coins or silver coins for its issued dollars. And the liquidity problem can be solved if you create a system of banks bound together in an association. If one is illiquid, it receives credit from another money issuing bank that is before the establishment of the Federal Reserve System. Those credits were called, inside the association, were called clearinghouse loan certificates. And the crisis of 1907, the first time that these loan certificates, clearinghouse loan certificates, we are before the implementation of the Federal Reserve System, not only were used inside the banking system, but also circulated freely in the public, in the market. And therefore, you already had a national currency at that point in time. Even so, there was no Federal Reserve System, and there was different banks issuing dollars under certain circumstances and so forth. But at that time, you created already something which is completely equal to a national currency in the modern sense. And the Federal Reserve System is historically, after this crisis of 1907, in order to create a real lender of last resort, is an association of private bankers, who had this idea, okay, we need some kind of a central bank on top of it, or we make a system of banks, and therefore we always have a lender of last resort. That was also Bagehot's idea for the Bank of England. When Bagehot coined the word central bank, he had no governmental institution in mind. It was more like let's make on a higher level, like a central for all these note issuing banks and get a real lender of last resort. Well, but that was in the US, it was done by private banking associations or private banks, And therefore, when there is credit right now between the Federal Reserve banks, this credit, as it was with the clearinghouse loan certificates, is collateralized. It has a certain interest rate, I think it's 6%, and it's secured, And it's also, there is some settlement mechanism. And in Europe, we made an association of central banks, but that was done by bureaucrats, and they completely forgot about the collateralization of credit which exists between the different European national central banks. And those credits, called the target imbalances, they can, if the currency union falls apart, there is no legal, there's no framework how they should be settled afterwards. So the likelihood for, if our currency union falls apart, that some of these, or most probably, or half, let's say, of these target balances are not settled is very high, and probably, okay, for the Fed intervention, was it interesting for you?
I actually had I got to look that up. That's very interesting. I didn't know that.
There's a few sources only. That's why I took these lectures, online lectures from Perry Merling. You want to know about the debt and the claims between the different European national central banks?
Oh yeah, that was my question. I mean, because I mean, I could go on forever, but I think let's go back to if it's all right with you, to the core issue of your worries about the euro system, the ECB. In other words, how does this resemble, Germany, Poland, and in the 1922s? And how do you think it could result in hyperinflation? Because my understanding is that when the ECB expanded its balance sheet and bought Greek debt, bought Portuguese debt, and the like, over the past decade, 15 years, that actually it coincided with deflation or disinflation. And whether you agree with the ECB or not, sufficiently low inflation, so much so that there was kind of a lingering slow growth period. So in other words, inflation was not too high or even hyperinflation, but it was too low. So tell us about why do you think there hasn't been inflation in the European system, European Union, and why do you think it will be different?
Okay, back to slide 80. And there you see the combined balance sheet of all these national central banks plus the ECB. The ECB is actually very small and not a real central bank, because the money is issued mostly by the national central banks. Nevertheless, that's the complete system. And you see the positions on the asset side, securities of euro area residents. And most of these securities we bought like with this huge purchasing programs, the PSPP and the PEPP, the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program in the last years. And this represents roughly, the numbers did not change that much, roughly 60% of the balance sheet of all these central banks. And every central bank, in simplified terms, during these purchase programs, bought government bonds from its own national or from its own government. And therefore, we have more or less 40% of these government bonds from crisis countries, which we already see like markets having trouble to absorb those government bonds. So we really needed the help from the central banks to, as a market maker, to stabilize prices from these bonds, but obviously they're risky. So 60% from the overall balance sheet and 4 contain relatively risky bonds already. And the other position, which is important, which is like 1/4 more over here, is lending to commercial banks, lending to European credit institutions. And if you really look for the small numbers, they're like the sub-positions, the main refinancing operations disappeared. There is no main refinancing operations anymore. We only have longer-term refinancing operations. 10 years back, or actually a little bit more, they only gave credit, on good collateral and so forth, to commercial banks short term, 1 week, 2 weeks. Now we give credit for like 3 years, which makes this position also very risky. And slightly more in Southern Europe than in Northern Europe. It's another issue. So to simplify further and to bring it into some metaphor, we can go to slide 81. And here we see my metaphor for the risks of a euro system's insolvencies or the ECB's insolvency, which could happen little by little in stages in the next 5 to 10 years and so forth. But I showed the liquidity, here, this water representing the money supply. And if my theory is correct for the 1920s, and if, for example, also in Argentina, the central bank was first attacked on foreign exchange market, the risk is that this liquidity, if not held back by the assets of the central bank, by the financial strength of the central bank, by its solvency, if these assets vanish, or if these assets dramatically lose in value, then the central bank is vulnerable, and this liquidity will attack our currency on foreign exchange markets. I did these slides for my lectures. Now we can go to 82, before the outbreak of the war on Ukraine. And by this butterfly, like I imagined some event. But actually, Putin relatively well matches such an event. Still, our bonds, we are still more or less okay. So the balance sheet, if we really look at the numbers, we are still fine. But like in the next 5 years, if the Italian or even just the German bonds and the Portuguese bonds, if all of them dramatically lose in value, central banks become vulnerable. And that at the end means that the euro has to devalue. And then we have a like in the 1920s or like in the last 10 years in Argentina, we have a predominantly, not only, but a predominantly exchange rate driven, devaluation driven inflation. The euro devaluating more and more against other currencies like the US dollars. I cannot imagine for the dollar becoming a weak currency in the next 10 years. Also for other reasons like demographics and so forth. But in Europe, we face many difficulties. Yeah, the butterfly here only represents like one unfortunate event. And if you take the wrong measures to fight inflation, like they did back then in the 1920s, which is to regulate prices, which is to regulate exchange rates by capital controls and so forth, you get deeper and deeper into this problem. In my paper, I really explain the mechanics of these strong exchange rate-driven inflations, because there are other political tipping points, right? So in order to stabilize prices, you need the central bank even more, or you have to use the central bank even more for monetary financing, and therefore you get into different dynamics. And that is a likely scenario for the euro area once, let's go back to slide 80, once mostly the securities, the government bonds get under pressure on foreign exchange markets. On European bond markets. You cannot stabilize prices indefinitely. So in Europe, more or less, for these countries, yeah, central banks are holding, let's say, 30% of the government bonds. Yeah, that was a limit. 33% was a limit set by the German Supreme Court. Yeah, and actually, in most countries we did buy a bit more than 1/3 already. But as I showed you before for the Reichsbank, if you buy them all, that was the ratio of treasury bills held by the market. Yeah, if you buy them up all, you cannot stabilize prices indefinitely. Yeah, if nobody else is willing to hold these bills or bonds, they're worthless. Yeah, and so we already bought 1/3 in order to stabilize prices. The ECB or the euro system is already a market maker for those bonds. And now if we buy up half, or let's say 2/3, we are coming in a more and more difficult position to stabilize those prices. Europe is facing a lot of underlying problems, more so right now with Germany facing a deindustrialization. Yeah. With the energy prices, there is an economic crisis now in the economic heart of the European Union or the euro area countries, with Germany facing this deindustrialization. It actually is right now. And therefore, the ECB or the euro system can become insolvent, if you want to use that. It's debased. Yeah, if it loses its financial assets, we become vulnerable, and then it's political decisions. If you try to stabilize or to regulate prices, if you try to regulate exchange rate, if you try to defend prices of government bonds, you're more likely to get deeper and deeper into this problem of a weak currency, which potentially could end in hyperinflation. I don't think so. The very severe hyperinflation, yeah, it's not going to happen in Europe. But something like Argentina, probably half as bad as in Argentina, yeah, that could happen also in Europe.
So one similarity I noticed between the European Central Bank and the Reichsbank of the 1920s, early 1920s, is the increasing share of their assets is government paper, either bills,
Exactly.
notes, or bonds, wherever on the yield curve. So I understand what you're saying on there, but isn't that also true of the Federal Reserve in the U.S., the Bank of Japan in Japan? Those countries, Japan and the US, print their own currency, whereas Greece does not print its own currency. Germany does not print, Reichsmarks or Rentenmarks. It is the euro. So to what degree is the fact that these countries are not in control of their own currency sort of the true culprit? And then also walk us through the scenario by which you imagine, let's say Portuguese bonds, which are assets of the European Central Bank. How would they be devalued? How would, if you were to take the solvency ratio, your equation there, how would that impact it in the same way it did in the 1920s?
Yeah, exactly. So let me explain the differences between, let's say, the Euro system and the Federal Reserve system. So the problem here, the asymmetry. Yeah, the crisis countries, they voted in favor for all these purchase programs, and the German and the Dutch and so forth, they voted against. But the majority in the governing council, it's the presidents from the national central banks plus like 25% voting power to the executive board from the ECB, Lagarde, and so forth. The crisis countries have the majority, and therefore they want this rescue facilities, these purchasing programs, and the others have to take in that association, in that currency union, liability. And there is no such asymmetry in the US because you are one nation, and the Federal Reserve only, except from the mortgage-backed securities, but the Federal Reserve does not really buy government bonds in order to stabilize prices. Yeah. Those are relatively liquid markets, and it's not a rescue facility in order to stabilize prices or to enable the US government to issue bonds. In Europe, we do it in order to enable Italy and Spain and so forth. The ECB or the Euro system works as a market maker with the purchase programs in order to stabilize prices, to make Italy and Portugal and so forth, enable them to roll over their debt to low interest rates. Yeah. So this is officially, obviously not what the ECB count or Frau Lagarde says, but many economists are on my side. And even like former presidents of the national central banks, not only from Germany, but from many countries, from other countries as well, they make the same claim. Yeah, it's already the monetary financing. Obviously, it's a continuum. Yeah, and there is 1% or 2% or probably 5% of monetary financing even in the US, because why they buy government bonds? Yeah, normally the central bank, if we go back to a very conservative approach of central banking, like what Bayshot had in mind, they should only give short-term credit, well secured, buy commercial papers and so forth. But they buy government bonds, yeah, which is already like a minimum of monetary financing, but on liquid markets, so it's not really needed for the US to issue bonds. And here we are already in the range of, let's say, 20-30% of monetary financing. Yeah, they don't give credit directly to the government. That would be 100% monetary financing. They buy on secondary markets, but they bought already 1/3 of all these bonds. Right? They did so in order to stabilize prices of these bonds, in order to make it possible for these countries to roll over their debt. And we come closer to a more severe monetary financing. I wouldn't call it monetary financing. So now by law, yeah, we have the Supreme Court decisions, the one I mentioned in Germany. So we are on the edge of monetary financing, yeah, by this Supreme Court definition. So, okay, the national part, yeah. So the voting power, each country has one president from a national central bank, and they represent 3/4 of the overall voting power. And there are countries like Cyprus and so forth. So the crisis countries, or the countries which are now in crisis, probably Germany joins and also wants more rescue facilities and more monetary financing and so forth. But they vote for monetary financing, but the others have to take liability. And there is no such problem in the US. The Federal Reserve would never, ever buy bonds from California, yeah? When California was close to bankruptcy some years ago. The Federal Reserve of San Francisco, yeah, it does not buy those bonds. And obviously it represents, I don't know, Oregon and Washington State and
Right.
8 different states. So you don't have this asymmetry, yeah? And in our case, we are more likely to vote for monetary financing because the interest of some countries to participate from this rescue facility and the burden being distributed between all members that's a huge problem. And Europe faces other underlying problems, which the US does not. Also, the dollar could become a weak currency. Yeah? If you buy more risky government bonds in order to stabilize prices, you're in the same dilemma. But I don't think so because, the debt is very high, but the next generation born to pay back this debt exists in the US and it does not exist here in Europe. So in demographics is very, very important. In Japan, it's also a huge problem. But here in Europe, mostly in Germany, we are together with Japan one of the fastest aging, without immigration, one of the fastest aging populations, or the fastest aging population. And so I don't see, like for the resources, the US is more or less fine. You have the next generation born to pay taxes, and Europe doesn't. So I think for these reasons, it's more likely that we choose this path of monetary financing, which could end in a very strong, not hyper, but in a very strong inflation of like 20, 30, 40% a year.
And monetary financing means the European Central Bank buying government bonds or government bills in rapid size. So that means the European Central Bank balance sheet is just going to explode higher.
Exactly. And at first it means, as we do right now, they buy it on secondary markets. But if your market share gets bigger and bigger, and if you are the only party buying, for example, newly issued government bonds, from on the secondary market from commercial banks, but if those commercial banks they can count on, like let's say Italian commercial bank buying Italian government bond newly issued, if they can count on the Bank of Italy that it's a week later or a few days later it buys it for a certain price, then it's already very close to monetary financing. So legally we are on the edge. Like in the treaties for the working of the European Union, how the ECB should work, there is monetary financing is defined as only if a central bank gives credit to directly to a public entity. If the central bank buys bonds from the government, and it can buy on the secondary market. The problem is that, and this brings me back to all my work and all my theory. The problem is that central banking generally was not well understood, and it was not well understood that the big inflations actually represent central bank insolvencies. So actually, in the treaties, they should have established not only you have to buy on secondary markets, but you have to buy on liquid secondary markets. You cannot buy more than a certain percentage of these government bonds. This decision from the Supreme Court now specified the law of monetary financing, but it was the German Supreme Court in this case. But the Supreme Court only reacted to what was reality already. So the central banks held almost 1/3 of the government bonds, and then the Supreme Court decided, okay, stop it right now, not more than 1/3. But if you had some such laws from the very beginning, for example, central banks are not allowed to buy government bonds at all, or only on liquid markets, or only a certain percentage of each specific bond, right? That's actually the Supreme Court decision. Then we would be more secured against this part of monetary financing. It's now in the debate, and that is a German Supreme Court decision. The European Supreme Court said that it's completely fine, the purchasing programs.
Very interesting. And what about as a solution to fight inflation, the raising of interest rates? The European Central Bank interest rates were at 0, then inflation exploded higher. And now interest rates, I just checked for the ECB, for the main refinancing operations, are at 4.5%. When you raise interest rates, all things being equal, and all other central banks hold them flat, theoretically, your currency should strengthen. So does this solve the problem? And for example, like Russian ruble devalued incredibly when the war first started, but then Russia raised interest rates, Russian central bank, to 20%, and it actually had a pretty miraculous stabilizing effect.
Okay, so there are two different scenarios or two different theoretical frameworks, let's say, right? So one is the normal world and the central bank being relatively solvent. And in this normal world, all this mainstream economic theory is more or less correct, yeah, in my view. Raising interest rate leads to a slight appreciation of the exchange rate, and there are nice models to explain this. And inflation is caused by demand pull or cost push effects and so forth, right? So I'm not talking about this normal times when the central bank is relatively solvent, and then raising interest rates is a nice, easy measure to fight against inflation. I'm talking about the additional risk, a completely different scenario, and which is not well understood in economics, if the central bank becomes insolvent, yeah, and then we have different dynamics, and we don't even know the history of these central bank insolvency-driven inflations, yeah, because they have other political dynamics, and it's once you go for that path, it's very difficult to end it because it's so costly, yeah, it's to recapitalize a central bank. As you can see right now in Argentina, it's not clear that it's going to work out. Probably not. And yeah, I just want to raise awareness for that different scenario.
So you're saying raising interest rates to fight inflation is a normal inflation fighting tool, and by definition, you're talking about extremely non-normal circumstances.
Exactly. And in this case, raising interest rates is also a possible instrument, yeah. And raising interest rate means also that the central bank has more assets afterwards, which stabilizes also its exchange rate, but it's little by little. For me, the main concern is that they start or they keep buying more government bonds, but anyway, these government bonds, maybe in the next 2-5 years, even the German ones get into trouble on bond markets. And then if they choose to buy more to stabilize prices, we are already on the road to severe inflation, yeah, to a weak currency.
So I want to now ask you a final question about what the cause of central bank insolvency. I think we've talked about two. One is currency devaluation.
No. The devaluation follows from the central bank insolvency. First, the central bank gets insolvent. Then its currency devalues. Speculation against the central bank, and therefore you see a devaluation on the black markets, yeah, or foreign exchange markets outside the country, which you cannot control or regulate, and also the black market rate. And then afterwards follows inflation.
Doctor, that totally makes sense to me. Okay, this is fake numbers, but Germany's bond is at 100. A Greek bond, the exact same, is at 60. That is implying some percentage chance that Greece will not pay it back relative to Germany because they're both denominated in euro. But I thought you said that when you were measuring the German government bill on the asset of the Reichsbank relative to a London bill, that they were one denominated in German marks, the other denominated in pounds. Wouldn't those devaluations imply the forward devaluation? I know I proposed this to you earlier and you kind of didn't agree with me, but I just want to make sure I have this facts right.
So right now, the difference between a German bond price and a Greek bond price is very, very low. It's more or less marginal. Mm-hmm. So in 2010, when we had to rescue Greece, usually this is measured not by the price of the bonds itself, but by the inverse, which is the interest rate. So what happened in 2010, when we started with all these rescue facilities, what happened that the 10-year interest rates for government bonds exploded in Greece up to 30%. And it increased strongly in Portugal. And it increased for some percentage in Italy and in Spain already. So until that moment, after we introduced the euro, everybody paid the same interest rate. Before Italy, Spain, and so forth, they paid higher interest rates because those currencies usually devalued against the German mark, and therefore, since investors demand a real compensation, they had to pay higher interest rates. And then they come together, converging of interest rates after implementing the euro, and actually already before, after fixing the exchange rate, definitely, everybody paid the same interest rates. And then the Greek interest rates shoot up to 30%, which means their bonds only reach 30% of their value, or 40% of their value. So the Greek bond price falling like a stone. And in that moment, they rescued Greece, and then all these purchasing programs. We started with the S&P, and later then we had 2012, Draghi, whatever it takes, and so forth, which is like an implicit pledge to or guarantee to buy up those bonds and to stabilize prices. So right now, the differences are very, very low between all these European bonds. I'm just saying that all bonds can come into trouble. First, most likely the Southern European bonds, the crisis countries, but also Germany is right now burdened a lot. And in that situation, if we want to stabilize further those bonds, I think it's the worst of all would be to make the central banks a bigger market maker, to buy more than a third, to buy 2/3 of those bonds, because we need, and probably we needed already back then when they rescued the Southern European countries. Greece was rescued, and they helped Spain and Portugal by these purchasing programs, and by the other rescue facilities. Mm-hmm. Probably, I don't want to really judge it, if it was the right or wrong thing to do. It could be much worse without this intervention. Right, but probably they shouldn't, because this spread in interest rates probably is necessary such that the countries which have to pay higher interest rates do austerity programs, other budgetary reforms in order to again receive lower interest rates. So now in my view, capitalism lives from investors, all these millionaires. I don't want them to sleep well. I want them to wake up at night sweating and thinking about that they lose all their investment. And that only works without those guarantees, without these rescue facilities, either by the countries or by the central banks, And only if we come back to this, well, maybe you default on your debt, we don't have an association where one rescues the other. No, every country can default. Like in the US, if California defaults. If Illinois also had problems, if they default on their debt, Washington is not going to do anything for this states. And we are not even one nation here in Europe. And I think we need the American approach of individual liability, for your debt, for your government debt, no rescue facilities from the central bank, such that the debtor is forced to do reforms and thereby to minimize its default risk. And this is also interesting historically. In the United States, you had the same approach as we do have right now in Europe. So you once raised the state debt from different states to the national level. And according to the historian Harold James, this ended or this also contributed at the end to the Civil War, because the North and the South, and it was an unsolved, for the Civil War, well, other issues were more important, but probably it contributed, at least to this historian, the unsolved debt issue in the United States. And now you have a system like in Switzerland, for example, where each state is more or less, there are transfers obviously, but more or less he's reliable for its own debt. And that's probably a solution. But as I told you, the Euro system, it's very decentralized, and the voting power is distributed such that the countries which need monetary financing, they can distribute the burden also to the rest of the member states. And therefore, I think we are likely to go into the wrong direction.
So I promise this is the final question. So the reason I brought that up, because I don't know how developed like forward markets were in the 1920s, but like right now in Japan, the reason that the Japanese yield curve is lower than the US yield curve or even the European yield curve, I believe, is because the yen is priced so that it will be stronger over time. So what you call as the solvency ratio, like if it's a German bill, a 1-year bill versus priced in Reichsmarks versus a British pound, 1-year sterling gilt or whatever. If there's a price discrepancy, people, they know they're going to be paid back in Reichs. They just think that the Reichs will be worth a lot less in a year. In other words, and by the way, they're right. So it is, would you say that kind of is a devaluation? It could be priced as like a forward devaluation in some sense?
Yeah, that's also a very interesting part. It's not here in the presentation, but it's a very interesting part, mostly about the German hyperinflation. When I showed you the other graph, that the mark in between also appreciated. And then you could see that until the summer of 1920, let's see if I find the graph, until the summer of 1922, the mark strongly in the last year, devaluated. So the mark was worse. I think in the summer of 1922, we had 20,000 marks per dollar. And it's incredible, but until the summer of 1922, you had to pay a premium on the long forward market. So we had the first devaluation, the first peak, and then an appreciation of the mark. Yeah, and then where it really starts to increase is in the summer of 1922. But remember, this is a logarithmic scale. Yeah, so the mark already devalued for a long period of time after that peak and its initial appreciation. Then it devalued. And until the summer of 1922, the mark sold with a premium, on the London forward market, against the pound sterling. So you had to pay a little bit more mark, point something percent, a little bit more mark to get the current exchange rate fixed for a month from now. And that is incredible, right? Because come on, if you, in the literature, I also double checked it. There are many sources that until the summer, that people were surprised always by the inflation. So after this appreciation in 1920, and then in 1921, they suffered inflation, but they were surprised in the sense of, probably, but the mark is coming back. We see the next appreciation. And only in the summer of 1922, it became clear, also on this forward market in London, that the mark most likely is going to devalue. And the mark started to be sold at a discount. During the stabilization, which happened afterwards in 1923, this fake stabilization, when they used up their remaining gold reserves,
all the gold reserves, it lasted 2 months, 3 months,
during that time, even so prices stabilized on the forward market, they expected a further devaluation of the mark. I used this data mostly to argue against another paper we mentioned already from Webb, still being like the main theories or explanations for the German hyperinflation, against his expectation augmented quantity theory approach, like showing that the expectations until summer of 1922 on the forward markets, not on German money markets, interest rates were completely stable, 5%. Even so, we suffered strong inflation already. And the people, you can find it in the literature, people were surprised by these inflations. And only after the summer of 22, they understand, okay, that the market is going to devalue.
Wow, that is fascinating. Okay, so the reason that I brought that up, and I promise this is the last thing, is because two different ways that an asset on the central bank balance sheet could become impaired that would lead to the equity being the capital being wiped out in insolvency. One is credit risk or solvency risk. The other is pricing forward depreciation. Maybe they're two names for the separate things because there weren't forward markets in the 1920s. The reason I brought this up, is that there's a third one we haven't talked about, which is interest rate risk. I mean, the Federal Reserve bought all of these bonds and securities when they bought it at a yield of like 2%, let's say, when the overnight rate was at 0, and now that 2% is at 4%. So all of the liabilities of the Federal Reserve are basically at par because they're overnight, pretty much. But a lot of the assets are long term. So I think that the Federal Reserve is pretty much insolvent now on a mark to market basis. Now, I and most people think that that does not really matter. Does that contradict your theory at all? Or is your theory only applied to credit risk, not interest rate risk?
We have exactly the same problem here in Europe because also it's true also for the bonds, and they are not mark to market. Those are some longer term bonds. So and the bonds are not mark to market. They changed it was mark to market before the start of this rescue facilities in 2010. Then they changed it to put the historical value, and they only report the losses once they occur. So if a bond comes to maturity, and then they have to book the losses, right? So, but they do it little by little, and this will show up little by little in all these national European central banks. And we have exactly the same problem in the US. But if it's only that, and there you're completely right, and probably if you do the math for the Federal Reserve, I'm not sure about your equity position, but I guess you have some because you also denominate the gold in historical value, but for sure this gold in market values is much more. So there is an equity position which is not represented in the balance sheet. Yeah, exactly.
Very good point. I didn't think of that. Yeah.
So probably you're with zero equity, only a few percent or minus a few percent, but that all of that doesn't matter. Even for such a big currency, yeah, it's different for the Argentine peso and for the Turkish lira. They're small currencies, first of all, so the institutional coverage is not as strong. Yeah, they're as for such a big currency. Yeah,
the markets aren't deep, whereas the U.S. world can absorb a lot of paper from the U.S.
Being a weak currency at the end means that foreign currencies come here to Europe, being traded on the black market and so forth, and that takes time. And also, it's very institutionalized. We all use euro all the time, and if the ECB does have a negative equity of 10%, forget about. No, it's not going to be attacked. Yeah, and the same obviously is true for the Federal Reserve System. So I talked about like severe central bank losses, but which I can imagine in the next 5 years. And then little by little, the euro could become a weak currency, but it's going to take time. And these losses we suffered from the interest rate risk, as you called it.
Oh, and they were kind of caused by they can mark their book over. They can make money overnight by by cutting interest rates to 0.
Yeah, exactly. If they have already these long-term bonds, but the problem is that they left the parts of the conservative monetary policy to only at the short end, no risk, no interest rate risk whatsoever. They bought long-term bonds, yeah, which now devalued because of the change in interest rates, but these losses, yeah, they are concerning, obviously, but it's not enough to bring such a big currency like the euro or the Fed under pressure. No way. Additional losses, real losses, yeah, in different magnitudes, and then the decision to buy more of these risky bonds in order to stabilize prices, that's could be a bigger matter of concern. And for the US, your overall balance sheet is not as expanded as in Europe. So for Europe, even this interest rate changes and the devaluation of bond prices is much more concerning. We have this structural problem of decision, voting power, and liability is not evenly distributed, and therefore we tend to have to go more for the path of monetary financing. And I don't think that the US is giving up its privilege to have the reserve currency that easily, yeah, to just make the dollar a weak currency. No, probably with the Chinese are very hard competitors, and once in the future you will use this privilege, but I don't think that you risk it by depriving the Federal Reserve of its financial strengths and making the dollar a weak currency. I cannot imagine. So, but for the euro, unfortunately, I can.
Wow. So you're not so much worried about interest rate risk. And if you're in the, people listening to this in the US, they can sleep soundly at night. But you people in Europe, you do want them to be alert and sweating during the night.
Yeah, no, 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 not people in Europe, all investors. That's how capitalism should work. And yeah, and hopefully, I really want the euro to be a stable currency. And I think the European Union was a very like fortunate project. And I feel like a European, but I just see like this dismal science problem here, because if the euro becomes a weak currency, we have so many problems. And it has to do with the German economy, which needs a strong currency because it has to buy patents and so forth. And we need immigration, skilled immigration, which is only possible with a strong currency. And like we're facing so many economic problems if we choose this path. So I really want to make everybody aware that the risk, yeah, is there, and it became much worse in the last 2 years.
In that last 2 years. Wow. Well, Dr. Sauer, this has been an absolute privilege. You're so generous with your time and insights. We've now gone over 3 hours. It's shocking. I just want to say, so we'll include a link to your piece, the lessons from 1923 for the euro area, enlightening the dark side of insolvent central banks' balance sheets. We'll include a link to that 360-page paper in the description for this, as well as, if possible, to the 98-slide chart deck and pack that you have prepared for us. Tell us also about where could people find the work that you do, the other work you do at Goethe University, as well as about your YouTube channel.
Okay, but my YouTube channel is only filmed lectures in German. And the idea is not to film the complete lecture, but to separate it into small models which you can really search. Yeah, so the next generation, they don't expect only, if they put it into Google, they don't expect only a Wikipedia article, but they expect also explanation. And at universities, so I teach, for example, introduction to economics. This semester, I taught some statistics and econometrics, and usually like banking lecture. So we have this explanation, yeah, from the classroom itself. So let's just bring it on Google and into searchable small pieces. Yeah, and that's the idea from the channel, in German called Wissen hat keinen Eigentümer, which means something like there is no ownership to knowledge. And that's the main idea. It's a completely non-monetized YouTube channel. I'm doing even a fundraising tour so I give speeches, and I donate that money to finance this YouTube channel.
Very nice. Dr. Sauer, thank you again for coming on, and thank you everyone for watching.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure. Ciao.
Thanks for watching. Remember to check out vaneck.com/HODLFG to learn more about the VanEck Bitcoin Trust, ticker HODL. A reminder that forward guidance episodes are available on all podcast apps and on Twitter, where I post them regularly at JackFarley96. Thanks again. Until next time.